When I was at MIT, I was working with a lot of visiting architects for both the Harvard School of Design and the MIT Architecture School. And at that time, I was what I would think of as more than 9 months pregnant, because I was not just pregnant, I was 3 weeks late. And I was in the midst of finishing up the logistics for this planning committee. And so I was working in an office where there was a big glass door, and there was a lot of visiting professors. They had a whole group from Japan who came, and they came up to the door while I was speaking to the translator to try to figure out where they can go. And all of a sudden, I see all these flashes, flash, 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 flash. I couldn't figure out what it was, and I said, well, and the translator told me, in Japan, when you're pregnant, you usually no longer work. You're actually out of the workforce. So they had never seen a woman, not just pregnant, but I'm not a very big woman, and I was 56 pounds pregnant, so I sort of had like a medicine ball in front of me. And so I turn around, and like, so this is the first time I was pregnant, and the first time in a workforce being pregnant, of course, and I was working mostly with men. So I went then down to the dean's office at the School of Architecture, and in the School of Architecture, we had about 8 professors from Harvard. A lot of them some of them were Nobel Prize winners, some of them had run their own architecture firms. They're very famous, you know, not of the IMP, but fairly high up. And then there was about 8 professors from MIT. We were sitting there with a seating chart, and for 2 hours there were arguments about, I have to sit here in front of this one, or I need to be near the podium, or I'm going to give my lecture so I have to be here. They were fighting as if they were in a wedding where they thought they needed to be near the bride and the groom. And the egos just exploded. It was constant. In the meantime, I'm sitting here, very, very pregnant, and it goes on for 2 hours. They're yelling at each other, screaming at each other. They're having tantrums. You would have thought you were in a group of kindergartners, for God's sakes. But the egos were so large. At one point, the dean looks at me. He says, he gets up and he goes out the door. And he has this huge door, this big oak door. And I'm like, where are you going? We gotta finish this. We gotta figure out who's sitting where. And he's like, just come here. He was a wonderful guy. He was Australian, and he had come from a big family with like 12 kids, and he was like number 11. So he was much calmer about this than I was. Goes out and he says, we're gonna go get a cup of tea. So we go down to the cafeteria, and I said, well, aren't you worried about them following you out the door? He said, those egos are so big, those heads will never get out that door. So we sat there and drank our tea and talked a little bit about what it was like having your first child. He had 2, and we had a little discussion. Finally, he says, 20 minutes is up. They've got to have finally gotten done with this. So I take my big sheet of paper that has all the, who's sitting where, roll it up, bring it back into the room, sit down. They continue to argue. And argue, and argue. This one's more important than that one. This one has run this kind of international architecture, and this one worked here, and this one was in London, and well, but I was only in Barcelona, so that doesn't count for London. It just went on and on and on. And finally, I was sitting there after 20 minutes of tea with 56 pounds of bowling ball on my bladder, and I thought, I've got to finish this. I can't keep going like this. So I threw open the plan, and I just looked at them and stood up as much as I could. Only one in the room, I got, you, here, you, here, you, here, you, here, you. I just went through the room, and they couldn't even say anything because I was so angry, and I really had to pee. At that point, I just sat down thinking, this has got to be over with. If it's not, I'm leaving the room. And my boss, as the dean of the School of Architecture, said, you know what? Sue is the only one here with any balls. And I looked down at this, and I was wearing this striped pink and white tent, Ringling Brothers tent thing, and I said, then how did this happen? That was my first time pregnant in the workforce.